Hello and welcome to FML Fund My Life, a podcast brought to you by MyWallSt. My name is Nicole and I'm the social media manager here at MyWallSt. And with me today is our top investment analyst, Anne-Marie. Just gave you that title, by the way. Sorry, Rory, if you're listening.
Rory definitely is not listening, so it's fine. I'll take it.
Welcome to this episode. The main topic is going to be all about Victoria Woodhull. Am I pronouncing that right, Anne-Marie?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay. And you might be sat there wondering, who in the world is that? Well, she was known for a lot of things, but as female investors, the thing we're most interested in was that she was the first woman ever to own a brokerage firm on Wall Street, which was very impressive. She was also the leader of the women's suffrage movement and was also allegedly the first woman to start a weekly newspaper. Victoria was also famous for her activism for women's rights and labour reform. Now, Anne-Marie, you know heaps about this woman because I think it was like 1.5 years ago, we ran a women investing campaign for Women's History Month, and you did a lot of research about her. You were going to create this long video. So that's where we got the idea for this episode. So stay tuned to find out all about this very interesting woman. And before that, I want to tell you all a very sad story. So I'm not even going to ask you how your week was on the stock market, Anne-Marie. I'm not going to ask you how your week in general was because, I have a very sad story to tell. Well, it's not that sad, but my phone was stolen on Friday night when I was in Lisbon, and I'm still very sad about it.
Yeah. Where were you when it happened?
I was on Pink Street, which is like just a going out area, and it got stolen there. The funny thing is, using Find My iPhone the next morning, I went on. Thankfully, I had an old iPhone in my house, and went onto my iCloud and saw that my phone was in this neighborhood. So I got my housemate up and we got an Uber to the location, and it was this kind of sketchy neighborhood near the airport in Lisbon. And we just I don't know what we thought our plan was. The taxi driver or the Uber driver helped us find where the number was and where the iPhone could be. And then our next mission was to try to get into the apartment blocks. We just literally rang every buzzer. And given it was Saturday morning at 10 a.m., people were definitely still sleeping. So then someone buzzed us in finally. But then we were in the apartment block and I was I don't know what I'm going to do now. I don't know what my plan was. And then I just started knocking on people's doors. And then I just got given out to by elderly Portuguese people and shouted at in Portuguese. And I did not find my phone. And then we had to just go home.
Wow. I commend the effort, though, going all the way to the apartment block to try and find it. But it's on the move now, isn't it?
It's on the move, on my Instagram story. It's it was still going around. He still has it on, which I'm really worried about. And I filed a police report and everything, but even the policeman was the chances of finding these is very slim. I was cool, great.
Yeah, interesting that they left it on there to be tracked, because usually the first thing that happens when people's phones get stolen, they put it on airplane mode so you can't see it, and then they go about trying to send you that fake Apple looking kind of phishing text to try and get your passcode off you so they can get into the phone and wipe it. Will be interesting to see. I remember I read an article literally 2 weeks ago about a girl who her phone was stolen. I think she was in California, and she just kind of gave up and was oh, whatever, because whoever took it put it on airplane mode. She was never able to track it, never knew where it was. Yeah. And then months later, 6 months later, she received a text message that was meant to look like Apple, and it was saying, "Oh, your phone has been found. Can we have your passcode to confirm that this is yours so we can send it back to you?" And she went to check her Find My iPhone and saw that the phone was in China, because apparently that's typically what happens is phones get stolen out of Western countries, get shipped back to China so they can be wiped. And then if they're not sufficient to be sold again, they get stripped for parts and components. And so then she had gone online to ask people to be oh, this obviously isn't Apple, but what should I do? What's the next step if I know my phone is in China? And people were you don't give them the passcode because Apple encryption is so phenomenal, they'll never be able to get into the phone. So then they'll just end up opening the phone and taking the components that aren't encrypted. So they end up just taking out the battery and stuff like that and selling it, taking the screen and the camera. But they'll never be able to get into the data. So that's apparently what you're supposed to do. So down the line, if you get contacted, just leave the phone locked, apparently.
Yeah, people told me they were be on the lookout for those messages, but it's just so sad. You realize how much of your life is on your phone as well. It's really your left hand. I did have I did, but I hadn't backed up to the iCloud in a few months. So even all my videos and photos from the festival I went to didn't get backed up. But We live and learn. Yeah. I'll be very careful from now on. But and it was my first time ever losing a phone. It was very sad.
Wow.
I'm very proud of the fact that I've never done that, but not anymore.
To be fair, I didn't lose it. Like, it was stolen.
Yeah. I know, but like, I was drinking, so I think I could probably had it in my back pocket or something.
Yeah. Tends to be. All right.
So enough about my sad stories.
Tragedy.
First world problems. Anne-Marie, let's get into the serious business that is the main topic of this show. So tell us all about Victoria Woodhull.
Okay. Well, let's kind of go back to her origins maybe before we talk about like why she's so famous, why she's often cited in history books as being the first female investor. So if we go back to 1868, that's when Victoria Woodhull and her sister Tenny Claflin moved to New York City. This is the beginning. They were Ohio natives who all of their childhood, really, and early adulthood, they led this kind of nomadic existence. They lived in a painted wagon. They traveled between frontier towns, and they were kind of performing children. They were child preachers. They were magnetic healers. They often made public appearances claiming to be clairvoyants who spoke to the dead. And Victoria claimed in her later years, the reason that her and her sister went to New York is because she was visited by the ancient Greek orator Demosthenes, and he told her that she needed to move to the city to change her luck. And to be fair to Victoria and Tenny, like up to that point, they had pretty horrible luck. The reason they lived this nomadic lifestyle, the reason they were kind of always on the run, was their father committed insurance fraud on a frontier town in Ohio. He purposely burned down, I believe it was their barn, and then tried to claim against the insurance, and the town was sure that this like wasn't correct, and they ran him out of town, and they told him he could never come back.
Would this happen if he was on Lululemon? Remember we had this conversation a few weeks ago where I think it was the last episode, where I was like, remember they give money to charity, so that stops people committing
Lemonade
insurance fraud.
Lululemon is the leggings company.
Oh, not Lululemon. Lemonade. Sorry.
Yeah.
Lemonade.
I was like, Lululemon. I was like, do they give money to charity? Yeah, that is true. Yeah. There you go. He wouldn't have committed insurance fraud. So they were running all around, but she had this vision, and, ancient Greek orator comes to her and he says, you need to go to New York City to change your luck. And I guess in some ways, like, that's good advice, because if you are a clairvoyant and you claim that you can see the future, shouldn't that make you like a great stockbroker?
Yeah, literally, that is what investing is, trying to see the companies that'll do well in the future.
Yeah,
so she might do with a bit of that now.
I know she might have had a bit of an edge there. So kind of the reason that Victoria and her sister Tenny were able to get away with this idea of being clairvoyant, the reason like that made them popular, that made them famous in the period, was because in the 19th century there was a movement, popular movement called spiritualism, and in the wake of the Civil War and its mass casualties, Victorian people were really desperate for ways to contact lost loved ones, and Victoria and Tenny took advantage of this, and they went from town to town claiming to be able to contact lost ancestors. So when they went to New York, they ended up befriending Cornelius Vanderbilt, who, for those of you who don't know, Cornelius Vanderbilt was a railroad magnate in the United States. He, into modern times, would be worth an estimated $2.3 billion.
Wow.
And at the time, he was the richest man to ever live on the planet, like phenomenally wealthy.
So how did they bump into him? Like,
they definitely did it on purpose. Like they were definitely like loitering outside his house because he was newly widowed. And so they were like, this man is weak. And so they show up at his house.
That's like us going after Elon Musk, like. It would be very hard.
I see, but like Elon Musk is like desperate to have as many children as possible. So like there definitely isn't in there. Do you know what I mean?
What? Yeah. What is that about?
Yeah, he thinks like the population is in decline. So he himself has taken it upon him as an individual to repopulate.
He's very good.
Yeah.
I'm sure God love him. Like I'm sure he's not enjoying it.
Yeah, he's really just putting in the work. Anyway, so these two sisters, they show up at his house because he's newly widowed and he's desperate to communicate with his deceased wife, and he becomes reliant on them because he wants to speak to his wife all the time, and they form this inseparable bond. And that is great because Cornelius Vanderbilt has the exact same thought that we have, where he goes, these girls can tell the future. So they could be really good at investing. So in 1870, he secretly helps establish Woodhull, Claflin and Company, which is the first brokerage firm in the world to be run by women. It's pretty good. That's some nice seed money from Cornelius Vanderbilt.
He believed them. Like he thought they definitely could see that, like tell the future.
Yeah, and he was kind of known as that. He during the period was like all into spiritualism. He was like he had kind of been known to be taken advantage of, because at that point he was already really wealthy and very famous, and like he could afford to indulge those type of things. And so this, as soon as these sisters start this brokerage firm, they become this media sensation. I looked up a bunch of headlines from newspapers of the period, and they're called the bewitching brokers, the queens of Wall Street, the she brokers. The New York Sun reported the sisters' arrival by simply stating petticoats among the bovine and ursine animals. On the first day their 44 Broad Street office opened, the pair were met by a crowd of curiosity hunters who gazed at the females and beseeched them with questions. But it's important to state that their firm was more than a mere publicity stunt. In its first 6 weeks, it supposedly made $700,000, and the sisters' status as brokers was like firmly cemented. Most importantly, the majority of Victoria and Tenny's client base was actually an entirely untapped investment market, which was women.
Makes sense.
Yeah. So what other brokers of the period had failed to consider was that the Gilded Age had created a number of economic niches where women could make and save large sums of money. So teachers, small business owners, society, wives, and widows, that was a huge portion. Was all these women were left widowed after the Civil War, but were left money. And then we had all these kind of really odd ones, entertainers, female entertainers that can make all this money. And so they all had this capital to invest. And the stock market at the time was very, very popular and up and coming. And so Victoria and Tenny gave these women a place to invest. Their office building even famously had a private back door, which led to a women's only lounge. And according to Victoria, this was the sisters' plan all along. She would later state, "We went onto Wall Street, not particularly because I wanted to be a broker, but because I wanted to plant the flag of women's rebellion in the center of the continent." Which, was a pretty strong statement in the terms of she had an understanding that economics and, financial independence was a necessary foundation in order to have liberation and freedom in other aspects of your life, which is still, I think, very true today.
Yeah. It's still crazy that we still don't have that, and people still have to preach that and tell women that, we need to invest because it is freedom.
Yes, it is. It's definitely a form of freedom.
So would you say she was the first person to kind of have this idea, or was she at least the first person to kind of actionize it by setting up this brokerage?
There was definitely female entrepreneurs and women who had come from families of wealth who would have been somehow involved in investing. I think she just often gets dubbed as the first female investor, the first female broker, because she had the business behind it, and she herself didn't come from necessarily a privileged background. But we could argue that going to Cornelius Vanderbilt and attaching yourself to the richest man on the planet then does make you privileged, particularly as that relationship continued to develop. Tenny ended up becoming his mistress, and the two of them were inseparable until the end of his life. And so they did have a bit of a leg up on the competition.
But then you would say that but they went out and made that connection. It wasn't a family connection. It wasn't something that they already had. So they did kind of hustle for that. You know what I mean? That's they took every opportunity, but they kind of made those opportunities as well.
Yeah. And it's also, I suppose, they knew how to effectively function in the society and the context they were existing in. They knew that this man had the power and the privilege in their society. And so they said, right, how do we get close to him? It's they're very interesting pair. But it's worth discussing kind of what they end up doing then with this wealth. If the goal was not, they didn't want to be brokers. The goal was they wanted financial freedom. They wanted to, plant their flag on Wall Street. It meant that their success granted them considerable wealth. And within a year, they used their earnings to launch Woodhull and Claflin's Weekly, which is a left-leaning newspaper. They published articles about women's suffrage, spiritualism, vegetarianism, free love, and socialism, which are all they're considered to some people radical concepts today. They were extremely radical in the 19th century.
Vegetarianism must have been very rare. How many vegetarians was there back then?
Yeah, socialism, I think, is the one that really caught people off guard, because they even dedicated articles to condemning the nefarious side of Wall Street. They examined fraudulent railroad schemes, fire insurance companies, which is a bit ironic, talking about their dad, bond fraud, stuff like that. And then controversially, they were the first publication in the United States to print Karl Marx's Communist Manifesto. It's the first time it was ever brought to an American audience.
And what was free love? Is that
free love is... Yeah, it's literally the 1970s concept of you shouldn't have to be married to be with someone. Okay. It was very acknowledging of the fact that women lose rights within a marital unit. They often openly discuss the idea that men were expected to go off and be allowed to have multiple partners, and women were expected to stay within the marriage unit, which is a very 20th century idea to be openly publishing articles about.
Yeah. I think they got loads of backlash, like.
Yeah, exactly. So they were publishing all these articles for a couple months, and it meant that effectively every single one of their advertisers pulled their support. But these women like forged ahead because they wanted to use the newspaper as a platform for their political ambitions. And Victoria even used her influence to become the first woman to address Congress when she argued for women to have the right to vote in 1871, which is very impressive. It did mean that in some ways that Woodhull is a bit different from maybe some of the other suffragettes that are famous in the United States. So we often associate the suffrage movement in the United States with Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton. But it's important. A lot of historians have actually stipulated that like Elizabeth Woodhull is a feminist. She's not a suffragette because she was pushing for these concepts of free love, which were far more radical than what Susan B. Anthony was fighting for, which was merely the right to vote. And so I think that that's like a nice distinction to have, particularly because apparently Susan B. Anthony like hated Victoria Woodhull, didn't like her at all, like thought she was really controversial, disagreed with her ideas of, you know, economic liberation, sexual liberation. So it's kind of like, even in terms of being a revolutionary for her period, she was considered very, very radical, very left-leaning. But kind of undeterred by these failures and being rejected by some of her contemporaries, she decided that she wanted to run for president. And so in 1872, she became the first woman to ever run for president of the United States on the equal rights ticket. And she named Frederick Douglass, who's a very famous civil rights leader and abolitionist, as her vice president. There is a caveat to this, of course, which was that she named him as her vice presidential candidate without like getting his approval. She just like named him. She like never went and asked him. I don't know if they'd actually ever met. It's just he was so famous during the period, and he was also like highly associated with liberal and leftist movements, and so she just picked him. So he maybe he didn't want to be on the ticket. We don't know.
Yeah, you can do that.
Yeah, that's like the equivalent of one of us running for president, and then you're just like, and I will pick Nicki Minaj as my running mate, and you never ask her. you just pick her. You're like, oh yeah, that'll be fine.
Like this one was the first of like to do so many things, like, and like so many massive things, like to set up an investment brokerage firm in Wall Street, to run for presidency, like as a woman.
So newspaper, and it's all, I mean, like it's money. It's having money to be able to do those things. Most definitely. And like just having the understanding of, she has like such a clear kind of overarching plan where she was like, right, I'm going to make money. I'm going to start a newspaper, which obviously in the 19th century, newspapers are the foundation of power, information, dissemination. And then she's like, right, with this newspaper, I will be able to disseminate my political ideas and then also have a platform with which to run for president. Like, it's very smart, like kind of a domino effect. But here we have to go back. There's a bit of controversy now. So she's trying to run for president. She's trying to stir the pot. Unsurprisingly, it's a bit controversial. Women can't even vote. Hardly they're going to elect a woman as a president. So in November of 1872, Woodhull and Claflin, the weekly newspaper, published a salacious accusation that a very famous Protestant minister, the Reverend Henry Ward Beecher, was having an affair. And there's a couple reasons they did this. Number one was they needed to kind of stir up circulation. They were trying to sell more newspapers. They were struggling. They didn't have as much advertisement revenue. And this was a really big story at the time. So they were like, if we publish this, we're going to sell a lot of newspapers. So that was reason one. But there's actually a secondary reason. Just for a bit of context, Henry Ward Beecher is the brother of Harriet Beecher Stowe, who very famously wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin, which is a very important Civil War era book in the United States. But anyway, Beecher, he preached against free love. He was a huge adversary of Victoria Woodhull, didn't like that idea. He, was like, it's not in the Bible, blah, 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 blah. But then Woodhull found out that he was having this affair. And she was like, you are a huge hypocrite. You're having an extramarital affair. And you told me that what I'm doing is scandalous. So she was like, I'm going to throw him under the bus. So she published this article in her newspaper. Everyone got excited. People were buying up newspapers. They were making a bunch of money. But obscenity laws in the 19th century were very different than they are today. And she ends up getting arrested and getting thrown in jail for charges that she was spreading pornography.
But she didn't they didn't publish photos or anything.
No, it was just like writing the story and insinuating.
Oh, you're not allowed to even say like sexual intercourse or anything like that. Oh my God. So you know what? I bet they were looking for a reason though to arrest her as well.
Most definitely. Yeah. Like she was so controversial and so infamous and like, yeah, definitely. So they chalked her up, on pornography charges, and she was arrested, and she spent a year in prison. And so when she was meant to be running for president and, you know, having her radical political movement, she couldn't do anything. She sat in jail. Yeah. Tragedy.
It's crazier than the Trump story.
Yeah. So she didn't end up getting elected president, or we'd be having a different conversation here. So she's sitting in jail. She ends up getting released. Sad day. And then by 1873, another blow. Their brokerage firm was forced to close in the wake of extreme market panic that happened in the 19th century.
Who was running it when she was in prison? Her sister?
No, yeah, probably, but they also had like employees and staff and stuff like that. And it was a lot of their brokerage picks, I know, like were quite obvious things. Like they were investing a lot in railroads and gold and silver and that type of thing. And they were getting tips from Cornelius. And but the entire, like, it was a massive stock market crash. So it wasn't their fault. I think like most brokerages kind of went out of business during this period. And so then there's all these lawsuits and debt collectors come swarming around, and it's very difficult. And within 3 years of this happening, Cornelius Vanderbilt died. And that was like, he was their rock. And his son, William Henry Vanderbilt, he was really worried because Tenney was so associated with the dad, and they thought that she was maybe going to contest the will and she was going to demand all this money. And so William Henry needed to get rid of them. And so he goes to Victoria and Tenney, and he's like, if I give you a lot of money, will you leave the country and never come back? And they say yes. And so Victoria and Tenney just move to England. They take all this money and they leave. And Victoria ends up there, and she gives lectures on women's rights, and she publishes a magazine called The Humanitarian from 1892 to 1901, but she never comes back to the United States, and she kind of diminishes in the public sphere. Yeah.
That's crazy. Like, to go from wanting to like lead the country, run for president, and then just being like, oh, you know what, I'll go. But then they did have a hard time. Like, she was in prison. She's in prison, but
no money. That's the thing, is like, in order for them to live this privileged experience, in order for them to become these great exceptions to what it was to be a woman in the 19th century, they had to have all this money, and they had to have this association with Cornelius Vanderbilt. And the second all that's gone, it's like they're just reset. They're just normal women again. And they're like, no, you obviously can't run your own business, and you don't have any money. So like, off you go.
So they're
like,
probably kind of happy enough that the son offered that.
Bit of a bailout. Yeah.
Bit of a bailout. Yeah.
Yeah. So I guess like Victoria's life and debut on Wall Street is this kind of powerful reminder that often the most important role investing can play in our lives is not as this job or this end goal, but rather a means to an end. So from a young age, Victoria understood that wealth meant freedom and power and the ability to like skirt societal expectations that suppressed her. And that being said, like, Victoria is such an exception and not a rule in the financial world. So starting with its conception in 1792, the New York Stock Exchange and others like it prided itself on exclusivity. It was only meant to be like rich, powerful white men who could access this avenue. It was 1925 before Una Keogh would become the first woman to join a stock exchange. She actually joined the Irish Stock Exchange. That's a great little Irish fact.
Yeah.
There you go. Muriel Siebert wouldn't become the first woman to own a seat on the New York Stock Exchange until 1967. And it's important to acknowledge that minorities also faced obstacles when entering the market. It would be 1970 before Joseph Surlis became the first African-American man to hold a seat in the exchange. And a woman of color wouldn't own a seat until Gail Pankey Albert did in 1981. So like 100 years after Victoria Woodhull opens her brokerage firm, a woman of color is able to get a seat on the New York Stock Exchange.
Crazy.
Yeah. That's to say that for most of the market's existence, it was completely inaccessible to the majority of the population, meaning benefits like compound interest and long-term wealth creation were completely off limits. However, thanks to the market being publicized in 2006 and the advent of commission-free trading, access has significantly improved. Like, that's something even within our lifetime that we have seen have huge impacts. I know Emmett talks all the time about like having to buy stocks back in the day in the 90s and having to call a brokerage. Yeah. And the fee to buy one share was $25.
Yeah. But even the fact, like, I know people our age, and like I know people who are 27 and they won't make a reservation at a restaurant if they have to ring them. They'll only do it if you can do it on an app. So like, I bet so many people like won't invest if you have to ring someone because we all have social anxiety.
Yeah, but it's also just the inconvenience of it. Like, you'd have to be sitting down. Like, you'd also have to be tracking, like, stocks in the newspaper. You'd be sitting down. Like, think of how hard it is to do research. That's another thing that we talk about all the time. There is such an advantage for regular people and individual investors in today's market environment because of the access to information that even just the internet provides. Like, even like the ability for MyWallSt to exist as a company and as an app to regular people is only possible because we have the ability to just gain access to all the like investor relations information from each company, to run financial models, to create investment theses, to be able to like get enough information every week to verify those theses.
To be able to package all of that content affordably in an app, like is very new,
revolutionary.
Even this podcast, you know, I think as I said before, we're the first Irish women focused investment podcast.
Yeah. And so it kind of brings it back to that idea of like, it's crazy to say it, but like we have discussed all the time that like a lack of participation in investing by women exacerbates the earning gap into a wealth gap that is really bad. Like 40%, the wealth gap is substantial. And it is a reminder that when we talk about the generational impact of a wealth gap, the generational impact of an earnings gap, like those concepts are still ongoing. And so it exacerbates inequality between the races and the sexes and the genders. And like it's just a thing of, I think people like tend to have that assumption of like, oh, we now have full market access, so there is equality.
Yeah.
But it's like, no, we're still trying to fix the hundreds of years of people's inability to participate in this system.
Yeah. And there's still so many like places to live in the world where like women wouldn't invest and they won't have access. But men would.
Yeah.
And there's still like so many places in the world where women like don't have access to their own bank account. They're not allowed to have a bank account. You know what I mean? Like, so I get really annoyed when people say that. It's like, well, but you know, you have everything now. It's like, no.
Yeah. No. Yeah. I think, and it is that idea that I think people sometimes think, oh, we live in a post-feminist and a post-racial society. That's a big thing that was discussed in the United States upon the election of Barack Obama, where everyone was like, oh, it's fixed now. Like everything, we're all good. Like we've achieved it. And I do think milestones like that are really important. Like acknowledging Victoria Woodhull achieving the first brokerage is very important and very impressive. And it's something we should remember. But at the same time, like she is just one of millions, billions of women, like who in many cases have not yet achieved that market access and made that first step into investing. So
she had a very unique story and a unique advantage in who she met as well. You know what I mean? Like she was fortunate enough, you know, people would say she was fortunate enough to live in America and be able to go to New York. Like that's a massive privilege, especially at that time. To go to one of the most like probably wealthiest cities in the world. Was it back then? New York would have been
definitely probably the wealthiest city in the world.
London, New York, I'd say.
Yeah, and just run into Cornelius Vanderbilt. We're all out there, all out there trying to just run into billionaires,
the richest man in the world. Yeah, of course.
Yeah. Speaking of, did you actually see the news recently that Kim Kardashian is starting a private she's starting, what is it, an equity firm? What is she starting?
Really?
She announced, like 3 days ago, she's doing she's starting, it's not like an investment firm. I think it's a fund. She's starting a hedge fund.
Oh my God.
To invest in up and coming media and like female brands.
Oh my God. Imagine if she invested in FML. Guys, please start tagging Kim K in our posts on TikTok, please.
Yeah. I don't know if we're quite...
She's Irish as well. Her mom is Irish.
Actually?
Kris Jenner is like, I'm not sure what percentage Irish she is, but yeah, she always talks about being Irish.
How distantly?
No, I think like one of her parents is Irish.
Really?
Yeah. Let me Google it.
You think we would be talking about that more? They would definitely. I say she has to be more than 3 generations.
Why would they? But like they more talk about
Irish.
Their dad,
No. I mean, Irish people would talk about that more. Like if I would say they have. To
I feel like we don't brag about that. It's the other way around.
Excuse you. Have you been in the epic Irish Immigration Museum in Dublin?
No.
I had to go there once to do an exhibit review when I was in university, and there's the whole last room in that museum is just a collection of photos of famous people who are somewhat associated with Ireland. And they have a big photo of Rihanna on the wall. And they're like, Rihanna is like some percentage Irish. And I was like, did you run this by Rihanna before you put her photo up in here?
I don't know about, well,
Definitely
I'm not sure. I have no idea. But yeah, so Kris Jenner is English, Irish, Dutch, German, and Scottish, which, you know, but
That's
then
quite.
Kim K did like a ancestry test, and she's not only 47% Armenian, but also 29% Irish.
Wow.
But
Just
I don't know, like 4% Spanish as well, and 20% British.
I guess you could
Wait,
just start tagging her in all the posts and see
yeah.
what.
But anyway, back to that. I actually, that's kind of cool. I knew she would kind of do something a bit different after she did the baby bar. Like, I
Yeah.
remember she was even like hinted being like, will I go to med school now? Like, what am I going to do next? You know,
Yeah.
I think
I
she
think
does have big ambitions outside of just like
yeah.
beauty and social media.
I do think she sees it though as an avenue to make money. Like I think the
Oh,
end,
yeah.
like it's she wants to be a multi
Yeah.
billionaire.
Yeah. Yeah.
And she's going to obviously identify whatever company she feels is going to be the next,
Yeah.
I don't know,
I love Kim
beauty
K though.
unicorn. Do
I love
you?
her. Yeah, I really like her. And I'll always defend her. I know she's not perfect, but like,
Wow.
do you not like her?
I I mm, yeah, I have a bit of a I'm very appreciative of her. Like it's very impressive that she has been able to pivot and like I don't know, like generate businesses out of her mass
Yeah.
appeal, which I think in some ways she didn't ask for, and so she's like figuring out a way to take advantage of it. I think that meme is funny of them being like, "Oh, Kris Jenner works, the devil works hard, but Kris Jenner works harder."
Yeah, they
But,
did turn a hard situation into like a
yeah,
billion-dollar company.
empire, like
But you know, she obviously was privileged as well. Like her dad was a very successful, like rich Hollywood
yeah,
lawyer. They were family friends with like the Hiltons. You know, like her
yeah,
first job I think was not maybe her first job, but one of her first jobs was working with like being Paris Hilton's like PA or you know.
yeah, yeah.
So
No,
like yeah,
I don't like her because I think I think like her family perpetuates like an unrealistic beauty standard to regular
yeah,
people and then lie and pretend like that they haven't used
yeah. I
like
know that. Like
cosmetic surgery
yeah.
to achieve that. And then it's like, I don't know, it's very gaslighting to go to people
Mhm.
and be like, we achieve this naturally via our incredible workouts and drinking only fruit. And it's like,
Yeah.
that's not true. And you're lying to people. And that makes, I don't know, I think it's like really bad for.
Yeah, I don't agree with all of that. But then I would also argue that kind of every model and famous person does that.
I know
But
it's just
they're
with them,
just the most famous, you know, they're
it's
just so famous, so
heightened.
concentrated. Yeah. No, that
Also, I
they
feel
could have
like,
made a really good example of telling people being honest. But like, yeah,
yeah,
I got a nose job, I get filler, I get Botox every month, you know, like
yeah. And I do think that they have stolen a lot of their look from like the
yes,
Black
yeah.
community in the United
Hmm.
States, and they have
Yeah.
never like credited them. And I also
No.
think we're in a really interesting like style and fashion evolution at the minute
Hmm.
where we're moving away from like the 2010s was all about like the tiny waist and the massive ass. And I think that's going
Yeah.
out of fashion.
Yeah.
And you could like the Kardashians are physically transforming
Yeah.
to
Yeah.
to meet the new standard. And
Yeah.
I'm
Everyone
like,
says they're getting their BBLs taken out.
yeah, and I'm like, you
Yeah.
can't do it. Like, you have to
Hmm.
tell people you're doing this. Like, it's so
Hmm.
horrible to say, no, no, this is just us. We're naturally doing it.
Yeah.
So I just, yeah, I don't know. They just
Yeah. And like I know they're
have
not
some
perfect.
reservations.
Yeah. I think they're like they're a product of, you know, their culture and they made the most out of it, but then
Mm,
they had to like, yeah, they had to do things to get ahead. But I do love the prison reform work she's done. She's like,
yeah,
that is cool. And like I know people are like, oh, she only did it for attention. But I was like, but like so many celebrities do nothing.
yeah,
And you know, and they still get attention. You know what I mean? But like at
mhm,
least even if she's doing it for different things, like she's still doing it.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. And I have heard good things about Skims. Apparently, Skims is quite good.
Yeah, I have heard really good things. But they're so expensive. I want to afford. Like,
Yeah.
yeah, if Skims went public, I would invest.
Hmm. That would be interesting. I'd be interested to see. I would be interested to see their financials. Oh, it's hinted
Mhm.
that Fenty that Rihanna owns. It's
Yeah.
rumored that that's going to IPO.
Oh, that would be big. I do.
I think that would be cool.
I only have one Fenty product. Yeah, I'd be interested. That would
Yeah.
be really like that would be a TikTok trend, like Olaplex when they went public.
Yeah,
That would be massive.
we could do a walk through the S1 on the podcast.
Mhm.
That would be interesting.
Okay, so we better get back to
Yeah,
topics of this podcast. Sorry for the little Kim K split, but you know what? I'm sure a lot of people would find that
I think
interesting.
it's interesting. Yeah.
So, who is the girl boss of the week?
Yeah, you see now this one is funny because we're after doing this whole episode on Victoria Woodhull and talking about her life and hyping her up and calling her this person, this, like people, when Hillary Clinton was running for president, a lot of articles got written about Victoria Woodhull because people wanted to look back and be referential. And they said, oh, who was the first woman to run for president? Oh, it was Victoria Woodhull. So a lot of people were writing these like really wonderful celebratory biographies about her, which is fair enough. But fun fact, I have 2 degrees in history. And sometimes an issue that we can have when people go back, particularly like pop culture goes back and tries to create heroes out of people from the past, is sometimes it means that you deprive them of their historical context, which sometimes means that you leave behind some problematic aspects about them. And that happens a lot with women who existed in the 19th century who were suffragettes. You oftentimes hear, like, people love to talk about Susan B. Anthony and how important she was for getting the vote for women in the United States. Susan B. Anthony was also famously quite racist. And so, you have to acknowledge the bad with the good. And so Victoria Woodhull has some similar issues. So as she actually got older, she was living in England, as she became a lecturer and went on these tours and wrote these articles in her new English magazine. She actually became quite conservative in her later life, and she walked back a lot of her previous claims. She denounced the free love movement, which people were pretty upset about. She kind of became this very about like respectability in society and stuff like that. So that was, I think, upsetting, and people tend to forget that about her. She also, which a lot of, again, suffragettes, people who were labeled as feminists in the 19th century, was a eugenicist. Hopefully I'm presenting, but she basically was a fan of like positive eugenics, as it was called during the period. And it was because a lot of women had this belief that the only way that women were going to achieve equality in society, this is, of course, prior to the advent of the birth control pill, felt that only women who were in absolute best societal and financial and economic position should have children. Therefore, it meant that minorities should not have children. Only rich white people should have children. Which is something that isn't alluded to. It's something that she genuinely wrote down in multiple articles.
Yeah. Oh my God.
And it was that idea that only desirable people should have children. Which, is a product of her obviously being from the 19th century and having lived in America. And, she grew up prior to the Civil War. But it is, I suppose it's just us doing our due diligence and acknowledging that, like, Victoria Woodhull, yes, is this impressive icon, but she also had all of these problematic things that came with her. So, in some ways, Girl Boss of the Week is also Victoria Woodhull.
That's very interesting. That's like the biggest shock Girl Boss of the Week. Like, the person we've been talking about for the whole episode, she's not that good.
Yeah.
I think it's important though that we say, like, we're not like saying like she was the most amazing person. We were like, it's interesting that she was the first woman to open an investment firm on Wall Street and run for presidency. Yeah,
and I think it's just that kind of splash of reality. There's actually, when we were doing research for this piece, it's rumored that there's a movie that is in development about her, and I know Brie Larson has already signed on to do it. There was a TV show that was in development about her that HBO a couple years ago. I don't know if that is still moving forward, so it'll be interesting to see how it's difficult, when you want to create these historical figures into something that's recognizable to a modern day audience and maybe something that's inspirational to a modern day audience. Sometimes it means that they are deprived of their nuance and their complexity and the reality of the time that they lived in. And so, I just thought, if we were going to talk about Victoria Woodhull and hype her up, it would be necessary to also say, hey, like, she also did some bad things, similar to how we just analyzed Kim Kardashian.
I think, though, it kind of seems like she's also, like, when she lived in America, she wants to be radical and make all these, like, things about, like, free love and make all these, like, big declarations. And then when she moved to England, like, she tried to be more conservative because maybe they're more like that over there and she didn't have as much money. So she's like, oh, this is my best chance of survival fitting in here is to be more like this and, be more like, like English people were known to be a bit more, like, eloquent and, like, conservative. So, like, it feels like she's a bit like, oh, well, what's the best way to get on here, which is very fake. And
she also, I believe, when she was in England, remarried. I think her husband was kind of conservative. I think it was just she was always adapting. She was
always adapting.
She was quite good for that. And she also, I believe, when she was in England, like, basically said, oh yeah, I was never clairvoyant, I was never a spiritualist, that's all nonsense, that's all associated with the devil. But, like, she was a spiritualist in the when she was a child in America, because like that's where the money was at the time. So
she basically said anything to get ahead.
Yeah, which actually is, it's funny that we ended up bringing up Kim Kardashian, because it is, you know, it is a thing of like, how can you finesse your circumstance?
Yeah, but that's the definition of girl boss of the week. Like, she girl bossed her life.
Yeah.
Wow.
There you go.
Wow. There's so many levels to this, guys.
Yeah.
But okay, so that's a wrap. Thanks so much for listening.
If you enjoyed this episode, tune back in 2 weeks' time.
If you want to follow us on socials, please do. You can find us on Instagram at Fun My Life Podcast, on Twitter at MyWallSt HQ, and on TikTok either on at MyWallSt and on our account dedicated to the podcast at Anne-Marie and Nicole FML.
And finally, if you're ready to start your investing journey and looking for resources, check out MyWallSt's Getting Started podcast anywhere you listen to podcasts, or download the MyWallSt app. Both will be linked below. If you want access to our list of stocks, handpicked by our analysts, and lots of other interesting finance and business content, download the MyWallSt app and create your free account today.
That's all from us. We really hope you enjoyed listening. Thanks.